Thank you all for coming to today's Russian Hands event, which is co-sponsored by the Overseas Press Club and the Harriman Institute here at Columbia University. We have two great panels for you today on Putin's Russia and communism and its collapse. My name is Charles Wallace, and I'm a member of the Board of Governors of the OPC. It's a great pleasure to see so many familiar faces in the room today, including many colleagues I worked with over the years in Moscow, Leningrad, St. Petersburg, and other towns in Russia. I first went to Russia in 1974 as the junior member of the UPI Bureau, and it was my first foreign assignment and left a deep and lasting impression on me, as I'm sure it did with you as well. I later returned 6 times as a correspondent for the Los Angeles Times. I was there when Gorbachev introduced glasnost and perestroika, and I made a fairly long visit to the Soviet Far East after the collapse of the Soviet Union. While the two panels today are covering completely different eras in the history of Russia, it's really amazing to me how many similarities there are. I had a great sense of déjà vu this morning when I read in a front-page article in the New York Times that Mr. Putin's achievements were designed in part to distract the Russian people from their economic woes. I remember writing a similar phrase in 1976, or was it 1981, as they say in Moscow, plus cha izmenit. When I first arrived in Moscow 42 years ago, I couldn't help staring at the vegetable store under my apartment building on Kutuzovsky Prospect. It was stare-worthy because it was almost completely empty. And yet today, I am reliably informed by my friend and colleague Doug Stanglin of USA Today that this same store is now the Moscow showroom for Porsche, whose cheapest cars sell for over $100,000. I wonder how many Porsches they sell in a given year. Yes, it's true you can now buy most foods in Moscow if you have sufficient rubles. But I remember last year having a good laugh when Russia banned imports of European foodstuffs in retaliation for the sanctions over Crimea, and even started having bonfires of French cheeses. How Muscovites must have created many of those wonderful anecdoti, those sarcastic jokes. At last, Russia can afford French camembert, but we still can't eat them. Was that really all that different from the Brezhnev years when party members and people like us with access to foreign currency could buy goodies at the Berezovka, while average Russians mainly did without? As I now write about economics for the Financial Times and other outlets, here's an interesting statistic. The per capita income of the USSR when I arrived in 1974 was $2,452. In China, it was $153. Today, China has risen to $7,968. And Russia, in 2014, the last year for which their statistics, had only was able to grow to 6,841. And I'll wager it's considerably lower than that today because of the collapse of oil prices. I think that's an interesting commentary on Vladimir Putin's rule, and I'm sure it will be discussed at some length here today. Like many of you, I had a number of Russian friends in the 1970s who always impressed me with the amazing breadth of their knowledge, despite having few contacts with the outside world. Samizdat books and Jazz on the Voice of America were two mainstays that I recall. I often thought if this country with all of its clever people would only open up to the world, it could join the world's richest nations. We spent a lot of time saying only if, and I'm sure that people today still say only if. I'd like to add one other point before the sessions begin. In addition to being on the board of the OPC, I am the chairman of the membership committee. Some of you here today are not OPC members, and I'd like to urge you to take this chance to join your colleagues who make this such an interesting organization. We have many members outside of New York, including in such faraway places as Paris and Bangkok. These two panels today are just a taste of the many interesting topics OPC members regularly meet to discuss, and we're working hard to make them even more plentiful, from book nights to panel discussions on how to protect your story notes from prying government eyes. I'd like to introduce you all to Patricia Krantz. Patty, could you wave to everybody? Patty is the new executive director of the OPC, and I should point out, a former Moscow correspondent herself. And she is shepherding the OPC through a wonderful growth phase and really helping push forward a lot of innovations. We're launching a new website next month, and our bulletin, available online and by email, is worth the price of membership alone in helping you keep in touch with far-flung colleagues who, like many of you today, we haven't seen in a very long time. So please, there are membership forms here today, or you can talk with me or Patty, and we will get you set up. Don't forget the OPC Awards dinner is taking place April 28th in the Mandarin Hotel in Manhattan. It's a terrific event. I'd now like to introduce my colleague, Alexander Cooley. And I'd like to give him, who is the director of the Harriman Institute, and give him the great thanks of the OPC for helping arrange this event today. Alex is a leading expert on the Soviet Union at Barnard College. And by the way, he's the son of my good friend, the late John Cooley, whom many of you will recall from his days at the Christian Science Monitor and ABC News, and his very prescient books predicting disaster for the U.S. in the Middle East. Alex.
Charles, thanks so much. And it's just a real pleasure to be partnering with OPC, and thank you to Charles, thank you to Patty for your vision and making this happen. I think for Harriman, as an institute that's devoted to the study of the region, working on media and journalism related issues is a very natural fit for us. There's so many topics right now: media freedoms, the crackdown on journalists, the social impact of changes in media technologies, this new propaganda debate that we're having that we're engaged with and continue to pursue. And without stretching the analogy, and Charles mentioned I come from a family of foreign correspondents, I think there is also a parallel in some of the trajectories I think the overseas correspondent and the regional institute have taken over the last 20 years, in that I think we've both faced institutional pressures and institutional questioning about what is the utility of regional expertise, right? What does it mean to have a regional expert in the field? What value do we add? Why can't we just rotate people who are, for us, good political scientists, good economists, good anthropologists into that position? So I think there's some interesting parallels there that I think have been reignited by events in Russia and Ukraine over the last couple of years, when all of a sudden now we see these op-eds. We don't have any Russia expertise. How can that be? Which is not entirely true. Yeah, and as we'll see. So I'm just really excited to be part of this, and again, we're really thankful to OPC for this event. So let me just introduce the first panel, and the members are all extremely distinguished. I'm not going to do them the full justice in that I'm going to severely truncate their bios. First up will be Carol Williams, who has 30-plus years covering Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and Latin America, with a primary focus on post-communist transformations in East Europe and armed conflicts in the former Yugoslavia, Chechnya, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Ukraine. Carol was a senior international affairs writer from 2011-2015 with the LA Times, correspondent at large based in Los Angeles. She traveled to Russia, Ukraine, and East Europe to cover developments like the seizure of Crimea, the separatist uprising in East Europe, the Baltic states' tensions with Russia, and the imposition of Western sanctions. But of course, she has extensive experience in the region. She was Moscow bureau chief in 1994-1998, Eastern bureau chief from East European bureau chief from 1990-94, and then also served with the Associated Press in Berlin and in Moscow in the 80s. So she has won many awards and distinctions, including most recently the LA Times Editorial Award for Best Beat reporting for her coverage of Russia and Ukraine. Welcome, Carol. Then Vladimir Lenski. He's a television reporter and news producer with 2 decades worth of experience in television news coverage and long-format stories production. He currently hosts Time Code, which is a weekly news review program on RTVI, Russian Television International. Launched in 1997, the channel is a global television network that offers Russian-speaking people throughout the world an independent source of information and entertainment programming in their native language. And for over 10 years, he served as U.S. bureau chief and correspondent for Russia's largest TV networks, Channel 1, TV6, TBS, and NTV, which was also winner of the Committee to Protect Journalism Journalist Press Freedom Award for upholding independent journalism. For the 5 years before that, he reported on domestic news for major Russian TV networks, so he has real experience in both the Russian and U.S. Settings. And then immediately over here to your right, to my left, Tim Frye, who is the distinguished Marshall D. Schulman Professor of Post-Soviet Foreign Policy and my predecessor as former director of the Harriman Institute. And Tim's research and teaching are centered in comparative politics and political economy. He does focus on the former Soviet Union and East Europe. He is the author of books like Brokers and Bureaucrats, Building Markets in Russia, which won the 2001 Hewitt Prize from the American Association for the Advancements of Slavic Studies. He is also director of the Center for the Study of Institutions and Development at State Research University, Higher Economics School in Moscow. He does a lot of work on a lot of really interesting topics, including political economy, Russian politics, the potential for institutions to reform themselves, and he also does a lot of work on public opinion trends in Russia. So welcome, Tim. So the format today will go for about 10 minutes each, and then we'll open it up to some discussion and questions. And just a reminder, as I shouldn't have to remind this crowd, the event is very much on the record. So you will be part of this proceeding if you ask a question. So Carol, please, welcome.
Okay, thanks, Alex. It's hard to believe that 16 years into Vladimir Putin's reign that... Oh, sorry.
Yep.
Where is it?
Would you like to use mine?
Okay.
There you go.
Okay.
It's hard to believe that so many people in the foreign affairs community are still scratching their heads and asking, who is this guy? Who brought him to power? Whose vision of the future of Russia is he executing? Why have reforms been abandoned and the East-West reset replaced with a new Cold War hostility? The conventional theory is that the Yeltsin-era oligarchs brought him in to safeguard their power and wealth. But if that was the case, it backfired pretty badly. Many of those purported kingmakers are now in exile or jailed or dispossessed or dead. Did Putin go rogue once he was inside the power structure? Or was it always his mission to return the country to its authoritarian roots and avert the fate of the communist-era security forces in Eastern Europe after those regimes fell? In spite of all the meticulously researched biographies, we don't know a lot about why this seemingly unremarkable operative rose to power and set Russia on its more aggressive course. We do know more about how he's done it. He changed the narrative. In his view, the West wasn't interested in being partners with Russia. It was out to defeat it. And defenses had to be strengthened to protect Russia's interests and its position in the world. Putin carried this off by systematically stifling all dissenting voices and restoring czar-like omnipotence to the presidency. He reasserted state control over the media and effectively returned one-party rule to the country with laws that aided his re-election and united Russia's domination of the legislature. The compliant deputies criminalized foreign assistance with democracy building and humanitarian aid, and weakened human rights protections by casting them as alien Western values. Putin's most persuasive theme has been that the West is bent on denigrating Russia and executing regime change. And the co-opted media portray him as the only man strong enough to stand up to this aggression and ill intent that's emanating again from Washington. Putin has successfully used NATO expansion into Eastern Europe as proof of a plot to strip Russia of its traditional sphere of influence. The NATO membership extended to the Baltic states and former Warsaw Pact nations is presented as turning Russian allies into hostile neighbors ready to aid the United States in its effort to depose Putin. The theme of Western encroachment came to a head during the Maidan rebellion 2 years ago, when Putin saw Russia's most important ally slipping out of his orbit with the European Union Association Agreement. There was also renewed talk after Yanukovych was driven out of eventual NATO membership for a Western-oriented Ukraine. It was just talk. It was going to take years, if not decades, before Ukraine would be in any shape politically or economically to join either of these alliances. But the Kremlin's media managers presented this as an imminent threat, The overthrow of Yanukovych was reported as a Western orchestrated coup that would next be played out in Moscow unless Putin took action. And he did. He seized Ukraine, he seized Crimea, and he sent troops and arms into eastern Ukraine. If all you watched was Russian TV, and by this time that was about all people outside of Moscow had access to, you couldn't help but come away with the conclusion that Kiev had been overrun by masked, black-clad, right sector militants in the pay of the United States. A strategically released intercept of a phone conversation between two top US diplomats discussing which Ukrainian opposition figures should take over the new government gave traction to this scenario of Washington maneuvering to deprive Russia of its key trading partner and arms supplier. The debates in Congress about whether to arm the Ukrainian government in its fight against the separatists served as the ultimate validation of Putin's claim that the United States wants to isolate and weaken Russia. NATO now encompasses all of the former Soviet allies of the Warsaw Pact and the 3 Soviet Baltic republics, which Putin's media managers have portrayed as betrayal by Washington because of promises that were made during the 2+4 talks ahead of German reunification that NATO would not deploy into East German territory. Putin's claim that Russia is the target of foreign aggression helped turn public opinion against the West at a time when much of the population outside of Moscow had become somewhat disillusioned with the democratic experiments. The Yeltsin years were a time of poverty and shortages and insecurity for most Russians. The gold rush of foreign investment in the 1990s and the insider trading of state assets that passed for privatization benefited very few average Russians. Putin was brought in to the Kremlin at a time of profound economic disparity to govern a country that was, that had very little positive experience with the emerging market economy. The Russia he inherited was a country with deeply wounded national pride. People mourned the loss of their superpower status and put out of their minds the repression and hardships that had come with it. Many in the region were hungry for a voice that was critical of the post-Soviet course and didn't view Putin's rollback of democratic changes as a threat to their way of life. Putin's depiction of Russia as a great country wronged by the West struck a chord with Russians whose lives hadn't gotten better, and his message that Russia wasn't going to take it anymore rallied these brooding constituencies to his side. This new era of defiance has been a major factor in Putin's sustained approval ratings, even through the past 2 years of economic crisis. In fact, the fall in global oil prices has fed neatly into this theme of Russia being under attack. Most Russians blame the crisis on a US-Saudi conspiracy to suppress oil prices and bankrupt Russia and foment a popular revolt against Putin. Putin speaks for a lot of Russians when he rejects Western criticism and sanctions, and also the idea that the West won the Cold War. This new theme of a resilient Russia can be seen in the Kremlin's more aggressive role in Syria. Putin portrays Russia's entry into the war as necessary to clean up the mess made by a US coalition that backed the wrong guys and left Syrians vulnerable to being overrun by ISIS. There's speculation in the West that Putin has overplayed his hand in Syria, that Russians will eventually resent the losses and expense of getting involved. But I think Putin's popular support is more durable than many of his critics believe. Times are tough right now for a lot of Russians, but as long as he controls the media narrative, I think he's going to be able to pass off the hardships and suffering as Western sabotage and not his own mismanagement. His message to the Russian people is that only he can protect them and make the country powerful again. And that's a message a lot of Russians want to hear and want to believe in.
Super, thank you. Vladimir.
It's very interesting to hear what Carol just said about Russians wanting to believe in this message, let's make Russia great again. Sounds a little bit familiar. All right. I guess I'm the most Russian hand among these Russian hands today. Carol spoke about Putin as a strong leader, or at least this image of him as a strong leader. And I would like to remind how this image emerged. Putin's history in power is the history of terrorist attacks and catastrophes, and in response of every terrorist attack and every such event, a little bit of liberties was taken away from Russian people. Putin's story started before he became the president. In 1999, with bombings in Russian apartment buildings. Many of you will remember that this happened in Buynaksk, Moscow, and Volgodonsk. Back then, almost 300 people were killed in those bombings. All those bombings were, of course, blamed on Chechen separatists, even though the suspected involvement of KGB was openly discussed even in Russian media, which sounds unbelievable right now that this kind of topic can be discussed on television publicly. Then came the famous statement by Russian President, "It sank." He, of course, was referring to a nuclear-powered submarine, Kursk, which sank in May of 2000, and in the year 2000, in August, I think it was, in August, yes. And again, it was all over the media, it was all over Russian TV networks, in the papers. Putin went to visit the families of Navy officers who died there in that submarine, and the whole country could see the horrible conditions in which those families lived, and people saw these crying women, and Putin was embarrassed. And now we know that he is a very thin-skinned person. He cannot tolerate being embarrassed. The payback came, quite soon afterwards. The management was changed on one of the networks where I used to work on NTV Russian television quite swiftly, and very soon after Kursk disaster. The new management was installed, which led to a lot of journalists leaving the network and trying to create new networks, TV6 and TVS, which were also subsequently shut down by the government under economic pretenses, pretty much saying that the companies were not successful, they are not, they cannot sustain themselves. The history of those terrorist attacks continues with the siege of the theater in 2002, Nordost siege, so-called Nordost siege. That siege was covered live on Russian TV networks, including NTV, with the new management, which was already more loyal to Putin, but I guess was more loyal to Russian public than to Putin. So there was this live coverage of this tragic event, which the Kremlin, of course, didn't like. So the management changed again at NTV. NTV became very much loyal to the Kremlin. And such, we pretty much lost the last viable TV network that would report independently on Russian events. There was this, very short moment of certain thaw, when Medvedev was warming the seat for Putin in the Kremlin for 4 years. A lot of us thought that this could lead to something better, that Putin will not come back in 4 years because it's just too obvious. We all see that, that just leads to, president for life kind of situation. And yet, nevertheless, he came back, and the second coming of Putin started with the preparations for the Sochi Olympics. And that subject became, the preparation for the Sochi Olympics became somewhat of a story that no one could criticize, a project that no one could criticize, even though the property was seized illegally from people who owned little hotels or restaurants on the sea coast in order to build stadiums and highways. It wasn't eminent domain situation. People's houses were just bulldozed overnight. So this was not something that was not allowed to be discussed or reported upon. All for this beautiful events, the Sochi Olympics, that were supposed to show new face of Russia, new face of Putin, which of course didn't work quite well since the war in Ukraine and the siege of Crimea. I mean, the grab of Crimea happened pretty much the same year. So what's happening in Russia right now is that Russian public, the people over 40 snap back to the very familiar behavior, something that they remember from the Soviet Union. We have to be patriotic, we have to trust the government. Everybody outside forces are all against us. We have to fight, we have to support the government. Younger people, of course, do not rely on TV. A lot of people don't even have televisions. They follow the news on the internet. And the thing with the younger generation is that they, in my view, are very cynical. They don't want to make their country better. They may want to make their personal situation better. They're trying to find better employment, and there is nothing really to criticize there, except I don't see that there will be another large, street protest in Russia anytime soon, like there were after the famous Duma elections a couple of years ago. And younger Russians are terrified of the new Iron Curtain, and they know where this Iron Curtain can be coming, and the coming of that Iron Curtain will be orchestrated not by the West, but by their own government. So a lot of young Russians are looking for the possibilities to escape, but this wouldn't be the same escape as for, the Russians who came to the West in the 60s and the 70s and in the 80s. They want to be comfortable when they move to the West. So this would be an escape of very cynical people looking for a better position.
Thank you, Vladimir. Tim.
Great. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much for the invitation and for everybody for coming. I'm not a journalist, so I'm going to put that right up front. But Alex asked me to give some general remarks about kind of information environment in Russia. And I don't want to rehash the general narrative about press freedom in Russia. I think the people in this room have a pretty good sense of television stations being closed down, pressure being put on advertisers who support alternative sources of media, the gradual disappearance of opposition figures from state television. We know that story pretty well. We also understand pretty well the story of the rise of this great conglomerate of Russian state television, led by Dmitry Kiselyov, the reader on Vesti Nedeli, who's most well known for his homophobic and anti-Western rants. And we're also pretty well aware of the rise of Russia Today, also known as RT, which many people in the West are very concerned about, seeing RT as the leading spear in the information war. So we have a good sense of these general trends and the decline in the quality of media environment in Russia and in the increasing politicization of that environment. So, but there's a lot to this tale, right? I mean, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that this is a good way of thinking about the media environment in Russia, and I think it's pretty undeniable. But I want to complicate this tale in three ways. First of all, I think it's important not to confuse visibility or prominence with effectiveness, right? Now, without a doubt, the Russian government's control over the media environment has an important impact on people's attitudes towards the government, on people's attitudes towards the West, and towards their political behavior as well. And the Russian government has been very effective at sowing doubt about the political intentions of Russia's perceived opponents at home and abroad, and also in denying access to alternative views. That said, effectiveness is very hard to measure, right? So despite pouring vast resources into Russia today, the most recent Pew Global Survey from last year, 40 countries, found that Russia's favorability rating was pretty dismal. Of the 40 countries surveyed, only 15 were viewed less favorably than Russia. Only 30% of respondents had a favorable view of Russia. And President Putin was even less popular. Only a quarter trusted President Putin to do the right thing. By comparison, the US, with all its warts, with all its problems, had favorability ratings of 70%, and President Obama was trusted by 65% of respondents. And this was pretty much true in all regions of the world except for in the Middle East, where nobody likes either Russia or the United States. So, now the Kremlin, of course, has been far more successful in shaping public opinion at home, yet even there may be diminishing returns in the extent to which the control over the media immediately leads to a public response in support of the government. So when a Russian polling company, the Levada Center, one of the really good ones, asked respondents to name their most trusted source of news in August 2009, 79% said television. Right? This figure was down to 41% in December 2015. So as TV has become much more politicized, Russians have come to trust television much less than they did even 5 or 6 years ago. Although, of course, they still watch television. This is the main source by which most Russians get their news. So before we get too worked up about all the posters of Colin Powell and on seemingly every phone booth in New York City. Do we still have phone booths in New York? On every billboard in New York City, I think we need to take a step back and recognize that there are real limits on the extent to which governments can simply put out a message and have people respond to it. Now, another complication to the general narrative about the media in Russia and kind of media freedom in Russia is public opinion polling. Now, I do a lot of public opinion polling in Russia, and I think it's remained really a bright spot that most Russian watchers just take for granted, as if this is true in most autocracies. But, we love reading the weekly, reports from Levada Center about trust in Ramzan Kadyrov, or attitudes towards corruption in Russian railways, or about support for the truckers' protest. Now, I'm not a China scholar, but I don't imagine they're reading about support for protests by Uyghurs. So I think this is really a bright spot that we really, I think, have to recognize. And now there's a big debate about whether Russians are telling the truth when they answer public opinion questions in Russia. And I've done some work on this with my colleagues. In 2015, we did 2 surveys in January and March, where we tried to figure out whether or not respondents were lying when they were answering their question about their approval of the activities of Vladimir Putin. And we used this really sneaky technique. If anybody's interested, I can go into the details. But what we found from our research is that there's actually very little evidence that Russians were lying to pollsters on this really very sensitive political question. And in retrospect, that's not that surprising. Right? Russia is an autocracy, and people can suffer for their political views, and they do. But at the same time, if we think about President Putin's approval ratings, they follow things that affect public opinion and public approval ratings in lots of countries. Very tight correlation between the underlying economic performance of the country and approval for the president. And this was true in the Yeltsin era, and it's true in the Putin era as well. And the big surge in public approval that we saw around events around Crimea is very similar to rally around the flag effects that we see in lots of other countries. Foreign survey companies have done work in Russia. They come up with results very similar to those done by Levada Center and FOM and SIOM and a lot of the other Russian companies. And also, if we look at Russian public opinion carefully, we see that Russians are very willing to criticize Medvedev. They're very willing to criticize the government, their governor, corruption, big business, and Putin is still very popular. But it does suggest that we can learn a lot from public opinion polling in Russia, despite the relatively repressive political environment. And Russia is pretty unusual among autocracies, and this is something we shouldn't take for granted. Now, the third point I want to make is that there's part of the general narrative that has been overlooked. And this is censorship among private media companies. Some of my colleagues at Penn State University, they wrote a really nice paper where they borrowed the title from the Yevtushenko quote, "When truth is replaced by silence, the silence is a lie." And what they tried to figure out was whether private advertising companies in Russia were sensitive to the content of the ads that they were asked to run. So they contacted more than 1,000 private media companies in Russia who were responsible for placing ads on the internet. And they sent them requests to run different kinds of ads. And they randomly chose different media companies to run ads with 3 different types of appeal. Some drew attention to efforts to preserve historic buildings, but didn't have any political appeal at all. Others, ads, criticized government preservation efforts, but didn't call for any kind of political mobilization. And a third side of ads that they tried to ask this company to place called for political mobilization in support of historic preservation efforts. Right? And what they were trying to figure out was whether or not these different types of ads would be accepted and put up at the same rate, or whether or not private media companies were saying, we want to stay away from these more political ones. So it was a very clever paper. And what they found was that these private media companies were very sensitive to any kind of political appeals or appeals to political mobilization. And that might not be that surprising, but it is different than in China, where people have done similar studies. And these private media companies in China are more than willing to put up ads criticizing the Chinese government as long as they don't call for any kind of popular mobilization. So in this respect, the media environment for these private media companies in Russia seems to be even worse than in China. So as is always the case with Russia, reality is a lot more complicated than a lot of the straight line narratives that we often get. And these complications that I've tried to introduce can make the general narrative seem more optimistic or more pessimistic. But I think in any case, it's really important to understand these complications and to challenge the general narrative and to try to look for ways to make it more complicated. Otherwise, we really risk oversimplifying what is a very complex reality.
Super. Thanks, Tim. Thanks to all the panel. So what I'd like to do now is open it up to the floor. Let's take about 3 or 4 questions to begin with, and we'll come back to the panel for answers. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, wait for the microphone, and if I could just ask you to state your name and your institutional affiliation when the microphone comes over. The microphone's right there, so if I could, if you go on stage. Sorry about that, thank you.
See if it works. How does this go on? Hello? Yeah, it's not really doing it. Great, thank you. I'll just use this one.
That wasn't working either.
Oh, maybe
Okay, now it's working. Hi, I'm Jim Brook. I've had many years in and out of Russia. I live in a city that we call Kyiv and you call Kiev. There's been a bit of a change in Ukraine. I was first in Russia for the New York Times in '91, and the Soviet Union actually, and then back for 8 years, first with Bloomberg, then with Voice America in the late 2000s. My question is about what will Putin accept in Ukraine, and I moved to Kyiv in November, and it was quite striking that the Russian language had been purged from public spaces. There's nothing written in Russian on the streets or in the shops or the menus of Kyiv. And just a measure of the anti-Russian sentiment, there was a motion in the Rada this week that all Ukrainian officials should refer to Russia as Muscovy to break the Rus link.
Yesterday, I was very lucky. I had a good chat with Steve Forbes. He'd written a column saying maybe Ukraine could sort of Finlandize. He was actually comparing it to Austria, which did not join NATO, but had free trade with the EU. You four, or Putin watchers, what do you think Putin, and it's the $64 question in Kyiv, we're watching, to some degree, Russia's broke, it's pulling back, but we don't know what Putin will do. The Minsk group is starting up again. There's some very serious people, Boris Gryzlov and Surkin, working on that. Would Putin accept a Finlandization of Ukraine, non-NATO membership, but perfectly good trading relations with both sides? What do you see as the outcome here?
Super, thanks. Let's take a couple more. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Alan Dodd-Frank, formerly president of the OPC and a longtime reporter. My question is about Putin's regime as a kleptocracy. There have been some great numbers thrown around about how much the guy has stolen, but very little reporting that actually can back up some of those sensational numbers. So I'd like you to talk about it.
Okay, let me just repeat that question for the record. Question on the panel's opinion on allegations of Putin's kleptocratic record and tendencies. And can we take one more? Yes, please.
Yeah, hi, I'm Debbie Siller from the AP, and I have a question to Vladimir and Carol, and basically to the rest of us. Because when you listen to the discourse in Russia, of the leaders of the country and the people, it is vulgar, if not filthy. And it's language that you can't print, or don't print in English. So how can one actually convey how these people speak when you think that it's normal when it's really not? So that's my question to you, to us, to academics, because I don't think it's necessarily conveyed in the way in which it's said.
Okay, super. Okay, so then a question about language, conveying the intensity, I think, of emotion, the colorful of feelings, the intensity of emotions too. So let's just go in order of the panel, and you can take any of those that you like.
Well,
Carol.
I think I'll try to answer Jim's question. I don't know that Putin would accept a Finlandization so much as a Transnistrization. I think the status quo works well for him. You know, he's kept Ukraine in chaos and crisis and, you know, a constant state of uncertainty and inability to move forward with reforms and, you know, corruption fighting, if that is their intent. He's a little bit hostage to the security forces that were very disappointed when he didn't send the Russian-backed troops and separatists all the way across the Black Sea corridor to establish a land bridge with Crimea. That had been anticipated, I think it was a year and a half ago, and, you know, I think he needs to keep that option of, you know, intensifying the support to the separatists open as an option, and because you know, he's not obliged to maintain any level of support for the disturbances in the East, but, you know, when it serves his purposes, he can activate it on a dime, and I think this would be sufficient for at least the foreseeable future. I don't think the Kremlin feels any pressure to come to an agreement with Ukraine about what their trade or, you know, other relationships should be in the future. There's, you know, some of that's still going on, even with the, you know, terrible deterioration of their relationship. So I don't see the Kremlin making any moves to resolve this standoff and to, you know, make the future more certain for the next Ukrainian leadership.
Okay, I'd like to answer the same question. Finland is a very successful country, and this is the last thing Putin wants Ukraine to be. He doesn't need it to be a success. And keeping a frozen conflict on its eastern border is the best way to keep Ukraine from achieving economic or political success or closer ties with Europe. So Finlandization of Ukraine is definitely not in his plans, but keeping Transnistria-like frozen conflict there is very convenient.
Great.
I don't know what Putin is thinking. I think it's important for us to admit that we don't know, and that all of our answers have very big bounds of uncertainty. I'm not privy to those kinds of conversations, and it's important, I think, to bear in mind that we're doing the best we can with the information that we have. So take my comments from that point of view. I think the guarantees of non-membership in NATO are a minimum of what Moscow is looking for in Kiev. But I think a lot of what Russia will accept depends on what happens elsewhere in Ukraine. I think we have to recognize that the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people have a lot of agency here, and not everything that happens in Ukraine is because of the machinations of the Kremlin. And Ukraine, I think, needs to do a lot of the heavy lifting, the really difficult heavy lifting. Most countries who are trying to conduct the kinds of economic and political reforms that Ukraine is conducting fail. I mean, it's just a very difficult thing to do, even with good intentions. So I think that is one of the things that President Putin is betting on. And having the pressure point of being able to exacerbate tensions in eastern Ukraine is something that he values, and the status quo is perfectly acceptable. I think it's also, though, important to point out that the horror stories about Russian intervention in Ukraine have also not happened. We haven't seen the sprint to unify eastern Ukraine and Crimea, or to expand into Novorossiya, or to go all the way to Kiev, which is an option that President Putin put on the table as something that was within the realm of the possible early on in the crisis. So, I think we should also recognize that there are constraints on Moscow, and there will be real costs to trying to expand beyond the Donbass and the Crimea. I also have a couple thoughts on the other question.
Please, absolutely. Yeah, I was going to also circle back.
I love the question about language.
Yeah.
And it made me think of the Putin-Trump bromance. And that a lot of people, Ivan Krasiev had this nice article in the New York Times where he said, well, Putin got along well with Berlusconi, they're both manly men, But I think why Putin likes Trump is that Putin enjoys pointing out that the U.S. has a lot of the same ugly, Islamophobic, anti-intellectual, populist elements that have made Vladimir Putin so popular in Russia to the point that he has 80% approval ratings. So when every opportunity he gets to kind of point that out is something that he enjoys doing. And on Putin's kleptocracy, all autocrats get rich. This is just not. I don't think that this is the most shocking finding in the world. Also, the nature of the wealth of autocrats is just very different. I mean, they don't have to have money in a bank account where they can just go in and say, "Oh, here's my ATM." The ability to persuade businesses to contribute to your campaign and to help build dachas in various parts of Russia are all very difficult very, very difficult to kind of specifically identify. So I've gotten asked to talk about this with the media on several occasions, and I always just say, I have nothing to say. I mean, I have no inside information. So whether this is a good guide for how Russia behaves is a different question. And I think there are a number of different things that, autocrats try to maximize: personal wealth, time in office, and those two things often don't go together. Often there are limits to what autocrats can steal, and we should, recognize that as well. Okay.
Carol, Vladimir,
All
some
right.
thoughts on?
Since the kleptocracy was the recent subject, the situation right now goes back to the familiar, for many Russian situation, with the glorious Tsar and corrupt boyars. This is exactly the same thing. There is this wonderful president who doesn't have a ruble to his name, and extremely rich circle of friends. So that is a sort of familiar situation for a lot of Russians, and this is why the society tolerance towards corruption in high echelons is so high as well. As to the language, it's a very interesting question. It's very difficult to translate into English, mочить в сортире. It's not just drowning them in the toilets. I mean, it sounds way too polite when you translate it into English. I don't know the answer to this question. You just have to, I guess, describe what this is. But without it, I agree, the message becomes not quite crystal when you translate it into polite language.
Carol, do you have any thoughts?
Well, the only thing I would add on the kleptocracy issue is, this is a very difficult subject for outsiders to approach. I mean, this is not an open society. The politicians in power don't have to file financial disclosure forms or explain, where they get their money or what they use it for. And even with those limitations, I think what Tim said about, it's so blatant. I mean, it's not even an issue.
Yeah.
You can see the Kremlin shaking down, oligarchs who have fallen out of favor and demanding their assets, and if they don't cough them up, they get driven into exile or put under house arrest or charged with corruption, and they go the Khodorkovsky route of being dispossessed. So I mean, it's sort of a phenomenon that was predictable, evident, and
It's also
irreversible.
It's also very different from the Yeltsin period. For whom a lot of people said people around Yeltsin got very rich, but I don't think there's a lot of evidence that President Yeltsin himself was interested in raiding the state coffers for his own private enrichment.
Yeah, just a couple of follow-up thoughts. There's a new academic study called The Hidden Wealth of Nations, The Scourge of Tax Havens by Gabriel Zuckman. And one of his findings, he very cleverly looks at intermediary entrepôts, especially Switzerland, and capital flows in and out, and he calculates that Russia and Eurasia by far have the most unaccounted for capital flight in the world. Just an astonishing number of revenues that are missing. So it really is this convergence of Russian state formation, malformation, autocracy, this global era of tax havens and moving money. It's a very contemporary type of phenomenon that's going on there. Let's take one more round of questions, I think, for the panel. Yep, and I think we do have a mic coming over.
My name is Shireen Brysock. Many years ago, I worked for CBS News, and more recently wrote a book with my husband on the Great Game. My question is, none of you have mentioned Turkey. And there was a rather alarming piece in the Washington Post over the weekend about how really they are on the brink of a war. And Ukraine may not be in NATO, but Turkey certainly is. And they've got, the other thing has to do, same question, but it has to do with the Sunni population. Most of Putin's Muslim populations are Sunnis. He's allied himself with Iran and the Alawites in Syria. How's that all going to play out?
Super. Others? Yes. In the mic. All the way in the back, 10 at 10, I think. Yep.
Hi, Tintin Japaridze, Slavic Studies here at Columbia. So while we don't have a crystal ball, and obviously we know for sure that Putin is not going to be around forever, no matter how much he wants to be around forever, what are the two types of leaders that we could hypothesize could take over Russia, and what would be the consequences for the Russia-West relations as a result? Thank you.
That's great. And let's take one more. Any other questions? Don't be shy. Yep.
Bill Holstein, I'm also a former president of the Overseas Press Club and not a Moscow hand, but allows me to ask naive questions. So what is Putin really thinking? Does he have a strategy for what he's doing, or is he merely an opportunist who takes advantage of specific openings? What is his ambition? What's going on in his brain? What is he thinking about?
So this is just terrific. Talk about big issue questions. So one on Turkey, one on Putin, master strategist or tactician, checkers, chess, the whole thing. And I think this leadership question also, Tintin pointed out, it's really important. It says there is a strand of public commentary, especially here, that ascribes Russia's ills to Putin's autocracy, right? And if we didn't have this type of autocratic rule, would Russia behave in the way it does towards Ukraine, towards Syria, and so forth? And so I think the answer to that has wide-ranging implications. What follows, what's the legacy, what kind of leadership, and so forth. So big issues. Carol, do you want to start us off again?
Yes, I'll talk about Putin's strategy or lack thereof. I think he is more responsive, and he's very skilled at tactical maneuvering. He gets himself, moved forward a little bit, susses out the situation and the reaction, and then diverts his mission as necessary. I don't think when he deployed troops into eastern Ukraine in the summer of 2014 that he knew how far they were going to go, or what territory they would take, or whether they were going to complete this mission of linking up Novorossiya with Crimea and the Rostov region. But his years as a KGB operative prepared him well for this kind of deciding how to deploy and operate in the field. Served him well as he went into the Kremlin and took this to a more global level. I think he doesn't have an end game. I think he himself doesn't know what's going to end up with Ukraine. The Syria involvement has major pitfalls for his administration. The question about the relationship with Turkey. I mean, Turkey has shot down Russian warplane. The travelers, the vacationers' jet out of Sharm el-Sheikh was shot down by, ISIS claimed it. These are high stakes for Russia being involved in the Middle East, and the Turkish support for the Sunnis clashes with the Russian support for the Alawite Shiite communities. They're getting very deeply involved in this Syrian conflict, and the mission to rescue Assad from near defeat could cause unforeseen consequences for Russia in the Middle East. And this is, again, I think, evidence of Putin's kind of short-sighted planning and operating. And he may come up with some brilliant response to these challenges from Turkey, but he may not even know himself what those are going to be until the time comes to switch.
I again have to agree with Carol on the question of the strategy and the strategic thinking of the leg thereof. There was a very good article recently published on Echo Moskvy's website, exactly on the same subject, and the author writes there that we as Soviet people were used to having these grand ideas and grand plans, like by the year 1980 the Soviet people will see the beginnings of communism. Or by the year 2000, Russia will reach Portugal, in GDP rather. Putin doesn't have plans like this. He seems to be reacting to the situations when they emerge. So it's hard to say if there is a big goal or big idea behind his actions. And that reflects, of course, in the situation with Turkey, because there is no end game, there is no end plan. It's very dangerous, however, because here we have this situation of two strong men. Erdogan is not a, liberal democratic leader either. So it's definitely horrifying to see how these two leaders behave to each other. In terms of Russia's support of Alevites, there is some anecdotal evidence of large groups of Muslim populations from Russia's south simply picking up and leaving for Syria to fight for ISIS. It's very hard to verify or quantify this exodus, but it does happen. So this potentially can become a very serious problem.
If I could just add one thing, an article I would recommend on the Turkey-Russia issue. In Foreign Policy magazine about a month ago, there was a commentary called The Tsar and the Sultan, and it was about how Putin is trying to resurrect the Russian Empire and Erdogan is trying to resurrect the Ottoman Empire, and this is pushing the two back into confrontation and raising all these issues that nobody seems prepared to deal with. It's really good. I would recommend it.
Let me start with the question that I'm kind of institutionally or occupationally most prepared to answer, which is about a post-Putin Russia and what type of leader will be there. Father Time always wins, right? So Putin is not going to be around forever. And if we think about Russia in kind of structural terms, it's too wealthy, it's too urban, it's too well educated to be as corrupt and undemocratic as it is right now. Right? So one way, even if you think about inequality, I mean, inequality in Russia is high, but it's mostly high because there are so many billionaires, not because there are so many really, really poor people. And there are lots of countries in Latin America who are democracies that have inequality rates higher than Russia. Oil is often cited as a barrier for building democracy, and that's true. But the Russian economy is more than just oil and gas, although increasingly it's played an important role. But that need not be determinative. So although the picture of Russia is 1,000 years of autocracy and a lot of Germany had a long period of non-democracy, Japan did, lots of countries have been non-democratic for long periods of time. There are reasons, I think, to be more optimistic about what a post-Putin leader might look like. What is Vladimir Putin thinking? This is a question I'm least prepared to answer, but let me try anyway. I think, in terms of tactics, on Ukraine. I mean, people have pictured Ukraine as this great, a victory for Putin, who's able to rally the domestic troops at home and take back Crimea, Krim Nash, also able to, weaken Ukraine. But I think if you asked Putin, would you rather have control over, the two regions of the Donbass and the Crimea, and the rest of the country that is virulently anti-Russian, or a Kiev that was like under Yanukovych, malleable, pro-Western government comes in, but it's Ukraine, so, policy, people rotate through government, there's not huge shifts in policy, a manageable problem. I think, a real deep strategic thinker would have said, I like that, I like that second version more than I like having, the rump states of Donbass and Crimea and the rest of Crimea being against me. So I don't think that, Russian policy towards Ukraine was this brilliant strategic move designed to, split Europe and, drive a wedge. I don't think that was what was going on. And I don't think it's been as much of a success as people say. On Syria, I think it was a brilliant tactical move to introduce military force by the Russians and to support Assad. You know, whether you think, I don't like Assad, I mean, there's all kinds of reasons, but from the Kremlin's point of view, that was an opening where Russia was willing to step in, to back up an ally, to pay a price that other countries weren't willing to pay. But what he didn't anticipate, and in the same way this is a similar problem to Ukraine, is that when you do something like this, the risk of uncertainty is so great, the risk of unanticipated events. You know, a Russian plane gets shot down violating Turkish airspace. You know, but for that, the crisis would look very, very different. So a real deep strategic thinker would have said, my God, there's the Alawites, and they would create complications at home, and there's Iran and Saudi Arabia, and we're trying to play them off, and we want them to cooperate on the oil market. At the same time, you know, we're siding with one against the other. That this becomes really, really complicated, and a different approach might have been, something that was a little more prudent and recognizing, what a tremendous risk and how high how great the likelihood of unanticipated consequences would be.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, in international relations as academics, we often sort of struggle with, do states act in a calculating, strategic way to maximize their interests, or are they more social creatures, right? Are they affected by things like concerns about status, about their identity, about their image? And I think how you answer that question really impacts how you view what the end game is or what the strategy is, right? If you view Russian foreign policy behavior as more driven by social status, then the very fact that they are now part of the conversation in Syria, that they are being paid attention to, that, you know what, if we don't use force in Ukraine and Syria, you ignore us. Now we use force, we're part of the solution. Now we're talking grand bargains. Now we're doing all these things. Maybe if the social dynamics are what's driving behavior out of the Kremlin and driving public opinion, then maybe that's enough. And all the kind of material consequences that we talked about can be sacrificed. But I find really in line of Vladimir and Carol's point about, this isn't strategic, or it's adjusting, in response to circumstances, and yet so many of the narratives that we read, and popular narratives, are the opposite. Right, that this is, decisive figure, master strategist, and in American circles too, in Western circles. So this is all very interesting. So please join me in.
If I may,
yep.
I wanted to address the question: who's after Putin? I think it depends on how Putin goes. If it's a quiet departure, then I'm certain that the next leader of Russia would be handpicked by Putin. And if it's not a peaceful departure, then all bets are off. The real problem in Russia right now is there's the crisis of leadership. There is since all the opposition leaders, or most of them, were severely marginalized. I personally don't see anybody who can potentially become a successful presidential candidate.
Yeah.
I mean, one bit of, I was very optimistic about, the post-Putin Russia, but there is one bit of social science research which suggests a much more pessimistic outlook, and that is we usually divide autocracies into personalist autocracies like Russia, where a single individual is really in charge and makes the important decisions. One-party autocracies like Mexico for years under the PRI, or China, and military autocracies. And here's where the bad news comes in. When autocratic leaders and personalist regimes, when they lose power, it tends to be really ugly. 70% of them lose power through non-constitutional means, shall we say, street revolts, assassinations, coups, and only about 20% of the actual leaders themselves end up not dead, not in exile, not in prison. And those figures are much, much higher for military-led dictatorships or for one-party dictatorships.
So Tim, you had given us the optimistic view.
I know.
We should have cut it off.
My fiduciary responsibility as a social scientist was